Hello, my name is Jessica Creighton. I am a Senior Equal Opportunity Specialist here at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Today I will be providing a presentation on NIFA's Civil Rights Compliance Review Process. Today's presentation is intended to provide a general overview of our compliance reviews for civil rights, including the purpose of our civil rights reviews, our outlook on our civil rights reviews, how we conduct them in terms of the process, as well as our statutory authority, and a general overview of the review areas that comprise our compliance reviews and the subcomponents of those review areas. Any one of the review areas is a civil rights topic that in and of itself could make up its own webinar, and we will have future webinars on various civil rights topics that make up the review areas of our compliance reviews. But today's presentation is just intended, again, to give a general overview and a general idea of what we look for. So those that coverage of the review areas will be a brief summary of what we look for there, with more information to come in future webinars. So to start off, kind of what makes up our compliance reviews. The statutory authority that we conduct our compliance reviews under include the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on national origin, race, and color in programs that receive federal financial assistance from any department of the federal government, including USDA NIFA. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination based on disability in any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. Title IX of the Education Amendments Act, which prohibits discrimination based on sex in any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. And the Age Discrimination Act, which similarly provides, prohibits discrimination based on age in any federally financially assisted program. The Americans with Disabilities Act, we also are covered under that law, and universities are covered under that law. It also prohibits discrimination based on disability, but in many other contexts, including public entities such as universities. And just a note about these civil rights laws, they do impose an obligation upon USDA and upon NIFA as an agency that extends federal financial assistance. It imposes an obligation on us to ensure that none of the programs or activities that we fund are discriminating or are not in compliance with these laws. So part of the reason that NIFA conducts compliance reviews is to make sure that USDA and NIFA itself is in compliance with these laws, and that we're fulfilling our obligations under these laws in ensuring that. So just a note about that. A lot of times we think about these laws, or land-grant universities or other recipients may think about these laws as imposing obligations on them, but which is true, it does provide obligations and requirements on universities and recipients of federal financial assistance, but it also imposes obligations on us as an entity that extends financial assistance to do compliance reviews and other things to ensure that these programs and activities are non-discriminatory. When we conduct our compliance reviews here at NIFA, we're really looking at them as an opportunity to do a checkup on our grantees and the programs and activities that we're funding, and to check in from a civil rights perspective with the civil rights lens on the various programs and activities that you're conducting. We look at it as an opportunity to provide technical assistance, to answer any questions that you might have, and to effectuate voluntary compliance. This process that I'm going to talk about today is a process of effectuating voluntary compliance. And that just means that we go through the process with the understanding that you're cooperating with us, and you're cooperating with the deadlines that we impose, and you provide us with documentation in a timely fashion, provide us with all of the documentation and information that we ask for as the result of our document requests. You make staff and leadership available for interviews so that we can complete our compliance reviews. And then when we issue our recommendations, you work with us to implement the recommendations that we had for improving your programs and activities from a civil rights perspective. And that whole process that we go through that we're going to talk about today is a process of voluntary compliance. And that is required by our implementing regulations that we attempt to effectuate voluntary compliance. That does not mean that compliance with civil rights laws is voluntary. There are other processes and other procedures for effectuating compliance with civil rights laws, such as administrative law judge cases and bringing issues before an administrative law judge, referring matters to the Department of Justice for enforcement and federal court, and things of that nature. But our hope is with the compliance reviews to utilize voluntary compliance instead of those other means and methods of effectuating compliance. A couple notes about our compliance reviews and our streamlined civil rights compliance review process, when and how these reviews happen. Some of these things are changes from the way things have been done in the past. But moving forward, we're reviewing each recipient of federal financial assistance separately. In other words, in the past, reviews occurred by state. And so if one recipient, one land-grant university in Alabama was reviewed, all three recipients, land-grant universities in Alabama would be reviewed at the same time. Moving forward, we are reviewing each recipient separately, so each university, regardless of which state they're located in, will be reviewed separately as its own entity. We will also be alternating between reviewing research program and research programs and activities, and reviewing extension programs and activities. And that's not to say that, if we do a research review and we conduct a compliance review of just the research program and activities for a specific university, that we won't, be willing to meet with the extension folks, and the extension folks can't participate in the exit and entrance conferences. Of course, recommendations, the result of a review of a research program, for example, and an extension program would like to implement them, that's perfectly fine. As we go through the review areas, you'll see that many of the review areas are the same, even the ones that aren't are similar. So it's possible that we might provide recommendations to one program and the other program might voluntarily decide, hey, that's a change we should make as well in our program. That's a good idea. But this is just to say that in terms of the in-depth review of everything and actually providing recommendations and communicating directly about a specific program, we will only be looking in depth directly at one program at a time, alternating between the research and the extension programs. These reviews are usually based, our review cycle and who we decide to review next is usually based on the date of the last review conducted. So everyone goes in order of when their last review was conducted. The reason this says usually is because NIFA has an obligation, a right and an obligation to initiate compliance reviews in cases that we believe there may be a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. So for example, if, hypothetically we were to receive, 20 complaints about an extension program, conducted by a specific recipient, a specific university, we might decide we want to initiate a compliance review of that specific entity, that specific recipient, outside of our normal review cycle as the result of, we've received all these complaints, we have reason for concern to look into this, and we have a right and an obligation to do that if we're made aware of other concerns. But usually the vast majority of the time, the reviews are going to be conducted based on the 7-year review cycle, every 7 years, alternating between research and extension based on the last time that we were out there. So it's usually going to be the systematic, scheduled, you've come up for a review because a certain amount of time has passed since you were last reviewed. The review cycle process, what makes up the review for a recipient are basically these steps that we have here. It will begin before the official scheduling and document request is sent out. Scheduling letter and document requests are sent out. You will receive a contact from one of our staff here at NIFA, civil rights staff at NIFA, reaching out to you in normal times when the coronavirus COVID is not a factor. We would reach out to you to kind of figure out what our on-site dates are that we're going to be visiting you. We also want to make sure we explain the process, let you know who your contact here is, make sure we have the right contact for our official scheduling letter. So you'll receive some sort of informal contact from us. And then the scheduling letter, which will contain the dates of the on-site, and a document request will go out 90 days before the on-site. And generally, when we are conducting on-sites in person, that will be a week. So our review schedule designates a month and a year that your program is up for review, and then we'll work with you before the scheduling letter goes out to designate which week will be there. And it'll be a week, including travel time for us. So it'll be about a week for us to conduct interviews and visit and everything like that. So the scheduling letter is just your formal notification that the compliance review is happening, and the document review, the document request is our detailed list of documents and data and information that we need you to send us for our review ahead of the on-site. And that document request, your responsive documents will be due 45 days after you receive the scheduling letter and document request, which is also going to be 45 days before the on-site. And our hope is that those document requests are as detailed and thorough as possible, and that you are detailed and thorough in responding to them, and that you also are timely in responding to them, so that we have sufficient information to review and we have sufficient time to review that information ahead of our on-site, and that way our on-site can be an informed and efficient process. That said, there will be circumstances in which we do need to request additional documentation at the on-site, either as the result of our review of your initial responsive documents or as the result of our interviews. So there will be circumstances in which we need to ask for additional documentation at the on-site or even after the on-site, but our hope is that you can cooperate with us, and the majority of the time we'll be able to get that wrapped up prior to the on-site. After we get all the documents we need, after we review them, after we do our on-site and conduct the interviews and get back and file everything away, we will issue our findings to you. and our findings can take one of two forms. The first option is that you receive what's called a certification of compliance. A certification of compliance is basically a form letter, for lack of a better term, just letting you know that we've completed our compliance review, we've received everything we need, and we found you to be currently in compliance with civil rights laws. If you receive this letter at this stage, that ends the review cycle process, and your compliance review is completed. The other option is that we conduct our review and we find some things that we'd like you to change or improve or fix, and in that case you'll receive what's called a letter of concern. And the letter of concern is a proactive document. It's a proactive letter that very succinctly lists what items we would like you to change, related back to the review areas. So related back to any findings we had, what changes or recommendations we think you should implement in order to address any review areas that we found lacking from our review. So it will be basically a list of items of things that we would like you to complete. So if you receive the letter of concern, you move into the monitoring phase, and you have 60 days to respond to our letter of concern. And you will need to respond to each item, and you can respond either with a corrective action plan, outlining what actions you're going to take and when you're going to take them by, or you can respond to each item, and you can do a mix of both, obviously, or you can respond to an item from the letter of concern with documentation showing that corrective actions have been taken. Sometimes, you may be made aware of something during the on-site or even during the document request that you need to have in place, and it may be something relatively quick and easy for you to fix, and you may have fixed it even before we issue the letter of concern, or you may be able to issue it in that after the letter of concern is issued, you may be able to address it within those 60 days before you need to respond. So you can respond with either or a combination of both for different items. If you respond with a corrective action plan, we would continue monitoring as you implement those corrective action plans until we get the documentation showing that the corrective actions were implemented. And then once we have documentation that all of the corrective actions have been implemented, we will go ahead and issue the certification of compliance letter, which is the same letter you would have received at the finding stage had we found everything in order at that stage after conducting our compliance review. But in the case that you had corrective actions to implement, then you receive it at this stage after you've implemented those. But either way, the letter certifying compliance ends the review cycle. And you're good to go from there until you come up for a review again in another 7 years. So, that's kind of our process, the basis, what we're looking to do with these compliance reviews. Moving forward into what our reviews consist of. So what are we looking for? What are we analyzing? And I want to address that these review areas are areas of analysis. It is not a checklist. So these are various civil rights topics and things that we need to make sure you have in place and that you're compliant on in order to be in compliance with civil rights laws. But it's not a list of things, documents that you check off. It's a holistic approach and look at these different review areas and what makes up the subcomponents. And so, for example, I will get into some examples within the specific review areas to explain a little bit more about how it's more of a holistic analysis and assessment of your organization within these specific review areas. as opposed to a checklist where we just need you to send us, you know, document A, document B, document C, document D. So here are the review areas for, again, I said we have extension program reviews and research program reviews, alternating between the two. And these are the review areas. As you'll see, they're mostly the same. Review areas 4 and 5 are different because they're more program specific, but they actually kind of look at similar things, just it's different because of how the programs and beneficiaries are in extension versus research. So the review areas that are the same here, we have organizational capacity, civil rights knowledge and procedures, advisory boards and committees, non-discrimination based on sex, public notification, accessibility for individuals with disabilities, and language access. And then there were two review areas that are different here are program delivery and data collection and integrity for extension, and allocation of resources in graduate school student enrollment for research. So to just kind of briefly, again, as an overview of these civil rights topics and what they mean, what we're looking for organizational capacity. So, you know, if you don't have a clear organizational chart in your program, for example, in your extension program, but you know, everyone is clear that we interview everyone in an on-site and everyone is clear on what the reporting structure is. Everyone knows who, you know, who they report to and who they need to go to for various information. We're not going to ding you and say, oh, you don't have an organizational chart, so you get an X on that checklist item and you're not in compliance when it comes to organizational capacity. No, these are things that we look at overall to help us determine, you know, how strong you are in this area. So maybe you don't have a clear organizational chart anywhere, but we interview everyone and everyone's aware of the reporting structure, and we don't see any organizational capacity issues there. We may say you're in compliance in this area, there's not an issue here. So it's really a holistic analysis of your organizational capacity, for example. In each review area is similar, and these are just subcomponents that help us kind of figure out where you stand here. So some things that are going to make up our assessment of organizational capacity is we're going to assess, is there a designated staff member for civil rights and diversity issues? What is the communication like between that designated staff member and both leadership, people higher up, and people on the front line? What is that communication like? Are there written assurances of non-discrimination with subrecipients or partners that a program or activity works with? And are there any red flags in terms of discriminatory employment practices? Review area 2 is civil rights knowledge and procedures. So what kind of training is there for staff on civil rights requirements? Is it sufficient? Can staff access the civil rights documents and information they need? Do they know, you know, where to get a complaint form for a program's complaint? Do they know where to look up the reasonable accommodation procedure if they don't know it? Are there procedures in place for filing employment discrimination complaints and program discrimination complaints? So in these reviews, we are under the laws that we're conducting these compliance reviews under, we're looking at employment discrimination in terms of broad policies and procedures, as well as any, you know, noticeable red flags in terms of diversity, segregation, things like that, because we're looking at discriminatory employment practices from the lens of how it affects program delivery. So that in lieu of that being a separate review, we're actually looking at it in terms of the extension and research programs and how it affects beneficiaries, participants, and things like that. And then we're going to ask about your internal compliance reviews. So how are you checking up on yourself? For extension, that's going to be, what is your process for looking at local extension offices and conducting compliance reviews of those local extension offices? For a research program, it might be, what are your reviews of your civil rights related issues? Is that something that happens on an annual basis? Who does that and what does it look like? But we want to make sure you have those internal checks and balances in place. Review area number 3 has to do with advisory boards and committees. So are these internal, external advisory boards and committees, could be called review panels, things like that. Are they reflective of the local and or the eligible service population in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender? What is the selection process like? Does it encourage diversity? Does it encourage adequate representation of the service population? And what efforts have been made to obtain diversity on boards, committees, and or to address any barriers that exist to adequate representation? So for all of these review areas that have to do with representation, we're not only looking at what is the reg data, what is the makeup of, whether it's participants, boards and committees, etc. We're also going to ask, what efforts are you making? What is the selection process like? Is this something that you're taking into consideration? Whether it be the selection process or the, recruitment efforts, is this something that you're taking into account? And whether that's to address, if you do have a representation issue, if that's to address that, or if you don't have a representation issue, we still want to see that that's something that you're trying to work into your selection process and keep a part of your process so that it doesn't become a problem in the future. So review areas 4 and 5, these were the review areas that were different from research to extension. But as you'll see, they have kind of similar ideas behind them. It's just different because of who your essentially your beneficiaries are of your programs. So review area 4 for research, has to do with the resource allocation. So we're going to ask about the process by which research projects are funded. It should be in writing. It should be easily available to anyone who could potentially receive funding for research projects. We want to make sure there are no unexplained disparities in the distribution of funding based on race, ethnicity, or gender. No unexplained disparities in the distribution of other resources like support staff, lab space, startup funds, and we want to see that the review or the selection committees any review or selection committees are diverse. And that could also fall under area 3. Because civil rights issues are interrelated, some documents, interviews, other information we gather can help us assess more than one review category. The 5th review area for research is graduate students, or graduate student enrollment is sometimes what this is called. The main thing we're looking at here is whether or not your graduate student enrollment is at parity with state reg data. Again, reg is race, ethnicity, and gender. Again, if it's not at parity, we're going to ask, what are you doing to address any enrollment parity issues you have? What are the procedures for assigning graduate students to assistantships or research projects? Are they clear, easily available to anyone who could potentially, want assistantships or research projects? No disparity. We don't want to see any disparity in the allocation of awards, assignment to research projects or assistantships, and we're going to ask about your recruitment process for graduate students. Is it clear? Is it non-discriminatory? And does it include outreach to underrepresented groups? And again, this outreach piece ties back to looking at where your reg data is in your enrollment and how it is in comparison to state data. And the outreach also has a piece with another review area, which is specifically about outreach, which we will get to later. So then for extension, review areas 4 and 5 are different. So 4 for extension, because of the nature of what the extension program does, is about program delivery. We're going to look at participants in clubs, activities, and programs and see if they're reflective of the demographics of the potential service population. Whether or not your recruiting efforts are successful in increasing and or maintaining parity in program participation by underrepresented groups. Again, if you're at parity, we want to see that you're working to maintain parity. We don't want to see any segregation in clubs. If there are segregation, you need to be making reasonable efforts to desegregate. So we don't want to see any clubs segregated by race, ethnicity, or gender. And then we want to see that all clubs, activities, and programs are open to all individuals, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, and or disability. The 5th review area for extension is data collection and integrity. So we're going to look at what your system is for collecting and maintaining reg data for your programs and activities. Are you analyzing that data against census data? We want to make sure that you're not observing demographic data and making guesses about participants' demographic data, but that you're requesting them to self-identify. And USDA's form for this is called AD 2106. I've provided it to our listserv before, and I can do so again. If anyone wants it, feel free to contact me. But you can also use your own forms or sign-in sheets to gather this information. You do want to gather ethnicity and race as distinct categories. So if someone identifies as being of Hispanic ethnicity, they also have the opportunity to identify their race as being white or Native American or Black African American, whatever the case may be. And we want to ensure that there are no apparent issues with data integrity. So that's just looking at things like, do your participant numbers add up? Is there any evidence of double counting participants? Things like that. And that ties into asking you about and looking at what is your system in place for collecting and maintaining reg data for your programs and activities. Review area number 6 is, excuse me. Review area number 6 is non-discrimination based on sex. So for this review area, again, we're going back to review areas that are the same for research and extension. That no program, activity, club, or group names contain sex stereotype names or illustrations. So this has to do with program materials, brochures, names of clubs and groups, and things like that. All programs and activities are implemented in a manner that ensures non-discrimination on the basis of sex. There are no sex-separate programs, activities, contests, or awards. We want to ensure that there's adequate sexual harassment policy in place, that sexual harassment complaints are handled appropriately, and that staff have had adequate Title IX training. So again, the Title IX training, this could be a part of your overall civil rights training. It could be separate. and it's something that we would look at under the review area 2, which I've already covered, but it also fits under here in terms of making sure that you have a Title IX component that includes discrimination based on sex and sexual harassment, things like that. Review area number 7 has to do with public notification and outreach. So here we're looking to see that appropriate public notification is provided, such as using the Injustice for All poster in physical spaces to notify the public of their rights, utilizing the non-discrimination statement on your website. And, you know, I'm going to ask you, how are you notifying participants in virtual environments using the non-discrimination statement or an electronic version of the poster, whichever works best for you. And then the outreach component, which goes hand in hand with looking at your program participants or your graduate student enrollment, things like that. You're looking at the outreach component to that. So are you collaborating with community groups? Are you conducting outreach activities that target underserved or underrepresented communities, as well as outreach in general to all communities? What kind of outreach activities are you doing? And this last piece, it can be beneficial to capture reg data for mailing and contact lists, specifically if you want to show your outreach to traditionally underserved communities. It's not always going to be required or necessary that you know the reg data of everyone you're conducting outreach to. But we want to see what kind of mailings and contacts you're doing. And if those are targeted specifically to address an underrepresentation, to document that as well. Review area number 8 has to do with accessibility for individuals with disabilities. So you need to have sufficient reasonable accommodations policies and procedures for processing reasonable accommodations. You need to be using a reasonable accommodation statement on your website or documents, specifically those that announce activities or events that the public can participate in. Want to make sure that your staff have training on reasonable accommodations and accessibility for individuals with disabilities. Again, that can be a part of your broader civil rights training, or it can be separate, additional to that. We want to see that you're handling reasonable accommodation requests appropriately. So does staff know how to handle reasonable accommodation requests? And then we're going to ask about how barriers for individuals with disabilities are considered in the implementation of your programs and in the implementation of your activities as you're conducting those activities. We just want to see that it's something that you're keeping in mind and you're considering as you conduct activities. Now, the last review area is language access. And so for this area, we want to see that you've assessed your potential service population and the language needs of your potential service population. That you've conducted that assessment and developed an LEP plan as a result, a plan for providing language access to individuals with limited English proficiency. We want to see that staff has been trained on LEP, individuals, on language access obligations, on prohibited practices. We want to see that competent interpretation and translation services are consistently provided free of charge. So interpretation and translation services should always be provided to LEP individuals who need them. They should always be provided free of charge. And we want to see that notification of the availability of these free services is provided, and that there is outreach to LEP communities, you know, in your service area that you identified as the result of your language needs assessment. And again, you know, there's some overlap here. Some of this notification could go in an earlier review area that we saw, review area 7, but it also falls under the issue of language access. So that is kind of a brief overview of our process, how we conduct the compliance reviews, you know, what our authority for them is, what we're trying to do, as well as what the various review areas are and what the content is. This is my contact information. Email is always a good way to reach me. Feel free to, you know, call or send me an email with any questions or concerns or needs for technical assistance that you may have. I look forward to working with you. Thank you for, you know, viewing this presentation, and thank you for your continued commitment to civil rights. Have a great day.